Chapter 3: Life, Death, and the Materialist Conception of Identity. One of the great burdens of the human condition is our knowledge surrounding death. On one hand, we have primordial instincts that demand we must survive, while on the other hand, we as thinking beings have realized that inevitably we must die. This contradiction between what we feel and what we know to be true has caused many to look for a way out. We either have to find a way of coping with our death, or we have to find a way in which part of us lives on, perhaps even eternally. In many cultures, the latter decision was developed into the concept of the soul. The soul in its most basic form is a way in which the conscious self lives on even after the body dies. It is a non-physical embodiment of our personality which allows heaven, hell, reincarnation, and all versions of afterlife to be possible. In order for a concept like the soul to appear feasible, however, one first has to conceptualize their identity in such a way that it is separate from the body. We often use phrases like "my body" as indications that the body is something we have, rather than something synonymous with identity itself. If you think this way, it makes sense why the question "what happens after death" would be asked. If our body and consciousness are separate in some way, death would not explain where the consciousness goes after the body decays. However, as I have explained in the previous chapter, there is no reason to think that a soul exists. There is no evidence for it, and all the experiential characteristics typically associated with it have been discovered to be processes of the brain and central nervous system. Realizing this fact can be terrifying, for if the sense of mind we have is actually an emergent property of the brain, that means when the brain dies we do too. Death is as real as ever, and we have to cope with it. It is only natural that we should feel terrified by the prospect of our own demise. After all, if our ancestors didn't feel this way, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. But is there a better way for us to view life, death, and a conception of what happens next? I think so. I think there is a way of dealing with death that is both emotionally satisfying and consistent with a rational scientific worldview. In order to do this, though, we first have to change our notions of identity. We have to challenge the idea that our body and consciousness are separate, and take the more nuanced approach that consciousness is a function of physical systems. Once we realize that humans are conscious and yet material beings, we have a much easier time answering the question, what happens after death? If all we are is our bodies and nothing more, then we already know what happens after death. We see it every day. If you get cremated, the atoms in your body go into the smoke and ash. They proliferate across the sky until they are indistinguishable from it. If you get buried, they go into the soil where they are recycled by microbes, fungi and plants until they are used to generate new life. In the case you are buried at sea, the fluids of your body will disperse into the endless waters. And in the unfortunate case you fall victim to a predatory animal, the creature will consume you, converting your flesh into its own. In this way, as long as your atoms remain on this planet, they will be recycled through millions of living things for ages to come. This cycle of molecular change is nothing new, and can be traced to our interstellar origins 13.7 billion years ago. In the beginning of our observable universe, to the best of our knowledge, there was a Big Bang which released a plethora of light elements out into the universe. These elements, which were usually molecules of hydrogen, helium, and other simple gases, coalesced around centers of high-density particles until their sheer mass catalyzed the first nuclear reactions in stars. Inside the furnaces of these giant cosmic behemoths, the particles that now encompass our bodies were forged into heavier elements such as carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. These elements were then dispersed by supernova explosions across the galaxies and caught in the gravitational pull of planets until they landed on the one we call Earth. From here, these molecules cycled through millions of organisms before reaching the one we now call you. They were in trilobites, dinosaurs, mammoths, and saber-toothed cats. They were also in cavemen, Neanderthals, explorers of antiquity, lords and ladies of the Middle Ages, and even our parents and grandparents. The air we breathe has been breathed by 1 trillion plants and animals before us. The oxygen in our cells was once flowing through the veins of every great historical figure, from the dawn of civilization all the way up to the modern day. These elements that compose our bodies are a part of us in very intimate ways. In fact, not only are they part of us, they are very literally us. We were once part of the stars, though we fail to remember. We were once part of the soil. We were once part of the plants, animals and microbes we share this world with. We were once part of the sea. We were once part of the skies. We were once part of every aspect of the ecosystem that has led to this point. Is it surprising that one day our atoms will return to their ancestral place among the earth, the seas and the skies? Many people like to think of death as an end to our existence, but it's not an end. That which makes up us, our physical essence, is recycled again and again across this universe throughout time and age. Understand that since the discovery of the conservation of energy outlined in the first law of thermodynamics, it has been known that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only change form. That which exists on this earth has existed since the Big Bang, and will continue to do so for untold trillions of years until we discover whether or not the universe has an ending. In the meantime, Einstein's equations have shown that when an atom splits, that which is lost in mass can be accounted for in new energy. The same can also be said in reverse, that which is lost in energy can be accounted for in new mass. E=mc², the most widely known physics equation in history, can give us some reassurance that as long as the universe exists, our physical essence in some way, some form will continue to exist. With this understanding, we must re-evaluate our problematic notions of death. What is death, if nothing about us disappears? Many will admit that while the physical materials that compose our body do not literally disappear, it is our loss of identity, particularly our loss of bodily form, which we should use to characterize death. This is of course more accurate and closer to the truth than the idea of a soul vanishing, but it is not without its own problems and misconceptions. For starters, even during life your body is not a fixed object. It grows, learns, scars and heals over time as each new day unfolds. The cells in your body are not the same ones you had 10 years ago, and the atoms that composed you at birth have been almost completely replaced. Physically, you are not the same person you were yesterday, nor the month before, nor the year before, nor the decade before. And the same applies to cognition too. Your mind is not a fixed object. Your perspective, your senses, the way you process emotion have all changed over time for better or worse. The human being, both physically and mentally, is always changing. You literally are not the same person you were in the past. So death, as a physiological change from a body into something else, is not truly an end. It is yet another change that we must experience like all others. The only difference between death and the change we face every day is that death is a bigger change than we are used to. However, simply explaining this is not enough to stop the anxiety that surrounds the end of life. It will not be enough to console a person who has lost a loved one, or remedy the existential angst that fills many hearts. In order to comfort those who are dealing with the prospect of death, we must address the loss of consciousness that occurs when the body shuts down. More so than any sense of self or physical description of the body, it is our consciousness that people identify with above all other things. We can understand that the brain grows and changes over time, but this feeling of continuity to consciousness, this feeling that there is something static that perceives our changes, is a thing that we cannot imagine losing. What happens when this continuity stops? What happens when the experiential aspect of the self vanishes? Do the lights go out, so to speak? Are we encapsulated in an impenetrable darkness for endless ages to come? People have a natural fear of the unknown, and as Alan Watts once noted, a lot of people are afraid that when they die, they're going to be locked up in a dark room forever. This is absurd, considering the fact that we all know what it is like to be unconscious. One way to picture it is to imagine a deep dreamless sleep that you never awake from. Another way is to remember what it was like to exist before you were born. You have no memory of your pre-birth, because your brain did not exist. Not only were you unable to perceive the universe, there was not yet anything resembling you that was capable of perception. In this way, non-existence is nothing to fear, for you cannot be angry, you cannot be sad, and you cannot feel pain. Non-existence is the ultimate notion of neutrality. It is peace. An eternal tranquility that cannot be disturbed. If this is what death is like, then we have no reason to feel afraid. Does a rock care when it's being skipped? Does the dirt care when we walk on it? No. These inanimate materials have no sensory experience or internal processing to make value judgments in the first place. They are as dead as we could ever be, and we don't go around worrying about the emotional state of dirt. Sleep may be the best analogy for the unconscious state of our afterlife. The only problem with framing it this way is that in traditional sleep you wake up. Sometimes you might feel a little groggy at first, but eventually you snap back into a normal state of consciousness. Now what if I told you that death was no different? What if I told you that you could awake from that endless state of unconsciousness, but you wouldn't have any memories of the life you lived before? This all depends on how you conceptualize identity. If your sense of identity is tied to the sense of an unchanging and static personality, then an existence after death is impossible. However, if you perceive your identity as being akin to your body's material composition and the conscious experiences associated, then something very akin to this happens all the time. Our atoms travel from decaying bodies into other objects and forms, some of which are living things and some of which are conscious. These living beings have nothing in common with you or I. The only thing associating them with us is that they share the same composing material. This idea of a shared essence which travels from body to body is nothing new to the Eastern world. For thousands of years, Buddhists and Hindus have been calling it reincarnation. The idea that your soul can be born into a new body after death. What I am describing scientifically is very similar to the idea of reincarnation, except that instead of a soul traveling from creature to creature, it is our atoms traveling instead. These atoms carry with them no semblance of our personality or memories, but they do carry on our physical existence. In this way, perhaps the idea is more closely related to the circle of life described in The Lion King, rather than anything from ancient religion. Consider the following lines from my favorite Disney film. Mufasa, everything you see exists together in a delicate balance. As king, you need to understand that balance and respect all the creatures from the crawling ant to the leaping antelope. Simba, but Dad, don't we eat the antelope? Mufasa, yes Simba, but let me explain. When we die, our bodies become the grass and the antelope eat the grass. And so we are all connected in the great circle of life. As these cartoon characters so eloquently explain, when we die we literally become part of other living organisms. This has been going on for billions of years and shows no signs of stopping anytime soon. What we have to decide is to what degree we are willing to identify with these future organisms. Are these individuals you? Or are they something completely separate? I think either answer to this question is completely valid. However, the way you answer it is going to impact how you view the afterlife. In one sense, yes. These organisms are very literally, physically you. On the other hand, absolutely not. Their personality is nothing like your own, and their conscious experience is entirely alien. Whichever way you choose to define yourself is completely up to you. All I am arguing is that we shouldn't base our notions of identity on falsehoods. If you perceive yourself as a fixed object, either mentally or physically, then you are dying every moment of every day. But if you view yourself as an ongoing assortment of atoms in motion, drifting in and out of a consciousness in a cycle of waking life, then death is an illusion and you are eternal. There are so many ways to define our identity that are both emotionally satisfying and compatible with what we know about the world. All of them depend on challenging our notions of self, which is what spiritual traditions try to do too. What I am describing is only the latest version of a philosophical tradition that has existed for thousands of years. It is doing what all other cultures have done. Try to make sense of death in a way that is accurate and meaningful. One of the ways I like to examine identity is to consider the life of a blood cell. A blood cell has a specific task and a specific method of achieving it. It will deliver oxygen to its fellow cells and return CO2 to the lungs, yet the blood cell has no higher awareness of why it does what it does. It has no idea that it is part of an organism which allows its life to be possible. If you ask a person who they are, however, they won't give you a chemical composition list. They won't start naming off their organs or cataloging their cells. They will tell you their name. The human being does not perceive itself as an assembly of individual identities. It sees itself as a whole organism and lives life as if it was such. There is no contradiction in these two views because both statements are true. Cells are both individual life forms and part of something much greater. Now, is it possible that human beings can say the same thing? Are we not also part of something much greater? On one hand, humans are very distinct individuals with their own drives and motivations. Yet when we come together, we create beautiful civilizations and vast interconnected ecosystems, each of which are beyond any individual person's comprehension. When we die, the systems we belong to survive for eons into the future. Our atoms cycle on in the world just as a cell's atoms cycle on in the body. So when I think of myself, I do think of myself as an individual. But I don't think of myself as just an individual. I see myself as part of a greater order that existed long before I was born, and will continue long after I am dead. Some may view this greater order as life, some may see it as civilization, and others may see it as the cosmos at large. Whatever your position is on this, it is undeniable that human beings are a constituent part of something much grander than we currently comprehend. It is also worth noting that it is not just our atoms which carry on in this world. A semblance of ourselves lives on in the hearts and minds of everyone we've come into contact with. Every time you've made someone smile, motivated them to do their best, taught them something, or inspired them in any way, you have performed an action which will have far-reaching consequences long after your death. Perhaps your kindness will inspire others to act kindly to those around them. Perhaps the skills you've taught someone will lead them to accomplish something pleasant in the future. Perhaps a little mannerism or joke you've made will be passed down from generation to generation. The consequences of our actions last far longer than our physical bodies. The only downside to this fact is that they can also have negative impacts as well. Just as acts of kindness can inspire future joy, acts of malice can inspire future suffering. This should be particularly concerning if you share the opinion that some part of your identity is linked to the material composition of your body. Understand that your atoms, which will eventually compose other living beings, will have to live and experience this world. This means that the world we create is the same world that our future incarnations will be born into. If we act to make this world a better place, then a better place is what we'll be born into. And if we act to make this world a worse place, then a worse place is what we'll be born into. This idea is not that different than the idea of karma, which states that your actions have consequences which will eventually come back to affect you in the end. It also has overlap with the concepts of heaven and hell, which state you will be either punished or rewarded for your life's actions. If the world and our broader universe is all that our atoms get to inhabit, then it is up to us to decide whether we will make the future content of our reality a heaven or a hell. We have it well within our power to make every country a totalitarian dystopia. We have it well within our power to pollute every last river, cut down every last tree, and subjugate every last man and woman. If we want to, we can create a misery that never ends. But we can also do the opposite. We are well within our power to make every country a free and wonderful place. We have it well within our power to restore our natural landscape and make the changes necessary to uplift people both politically and economically. What if we lived life in this way? What if we took part in positive action not only to make the world better for our kids and grandkids, but for an abstract version of ourselves as well? What if we saw no significant distinction between ourselves and nature, or between the human being and its composing materials? This is a way we could choose to view the world. Not only would it be pleasant and hopeful, but it would be consistent with a materialist worldview. You would have an obligation to help the world because you recognize that you are the world. You would have a duty to treat your fellow person with respect because you recognize their common humanity. Obviously, there are some who will find this way of thinking too figurative and filled with flowery language for their liking. The brute fact of the matter is that our bodies will die and our mental faculties will dissipate. I am not denying any of this. But for those who are contemplating the real fears of non-existence, I recommend the words of Mark Twain, who said, "Annihilation has no terrors for me, because I have already tried it before I was born. 100 million years and I have suffered more in an hour in this life than I remember to have suffered in the whole 100 million years put together." Understand that the experience of non-existence is not an experience. You will be okay. The only thing you need to concern yourself with is how you're living this life. Because if your present life is long and fulfilling, you won't need another. Our personal lives might come to an end. But existence is a different story.